Well, this week we continue in our story and study of the crucifixion of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. We are in chapter 15. We're going to be looking at verses 21 through verses 32. 21 through 32, we're going to continue in this story, continue on this journey as a reminder of where we have been. It is now Friday morning of Holy Week. Last night on Thursday night was the upper room. That was the Passover meal translated into the Last Supper. That was the trip to the Garden of Gethsemane and the arrest of Jesus. His trial has happened overnight. He has been found guilty. He has been taken to Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate couldn't figure out why he was supposed to kill him, but that's what the people wanted, and to avert politically a catastrophe through a revolt or a rebellion of some kind, Pilate washed his hands of the whole thing and turned Jesus over to be crucified. And then the soldiers took him away and they beat him and they mocked him. And last week we talked about the purple robe and the crown of thorns. So we pick up there in the story in chapter 15, again starting in verses 21 and going down through verses 32. Let's listen to the word of the Lord. We're going to take a look at the passage, and then we're going to come back and pick it apart verse by verse. So let's listen to the word of the Lord. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read the King of the Jews. They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. Thanks be to God for the reading of this word. So let's go back and take a look at the story. Again, it's a very familiar story. This is a story that we go over every Easter time. If you've ever gone to a Maundy, Thursday service or a Good Friday service, chances are you know this story. You've heard this story before. But it's important for those of you who have heard this story before to reserve those memories, to hold on to those memories, but to take a look at this passage with fresh eyes, to understand that you know this story, you've heard this story, but to attempt to hear it again with fresh ears. Those of you who don't know this story, then you have the benefit because of the fact that you get to hear it for the first time genuinely. And so you get to experience it for the first time. Also, too, a reminder as we go over this passage is that we're reading the Gospel of Mark. Now, there are 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and all 4 of them have an account of the crucifixion. And each one of them have elements that are common, but some of them have elements that are a little different, nuances that are added. Again, let's remember that if there's an accident in the middle of an intersection and there's someone standing on each one of the 4 corners, and someone comes and has a conversation with each one of the witnesses, they will give a different account of the same accident because they see it from a different perspective. Something was important to them that maybe someone else didn't pick up. It doesn't make their testimony false. It just gives a full 360-degree view of the exact same event. And that's why we have 4 Gospels, so that God can give us a 360-degree view of the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. So with that said, you're going to be reading this story, we're going to be studying this story, and you're going to remember things that you read or studied in Matthew or in Luke or in John. And those are wonderful. Please don't discard those. But for the case of this study, let's just refer to what Mark talks about. Let's just refer to what Mark is communicating without bringing in those other Gospels just for this study. So let's take a look. We'll pick up in verse 21. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. So we've got to understand what's going on here. We know for sure from Mark's account that Jesus was beaten, he was scourged, almost to the point of death. And so when it came time for him to head out for the actual crucifixion, it was tradition that the Roman authorities would make the criminals, make the ones who were condemned to death, carry their own cross. Now, they didn't carry the cross, meaning the up and down bar and the side to side bar, because the Romans kept that up and down, the main piece of a cross, in the ground wherever they do the crucifixions, just to save time. They kept those pieces solidly in the ground all the time. They were always there. So what a criminal would carry would be their crossbar. Their crossbar is what they would carry to the cross, and it was a way of carrying out that punishment. And it was also a public humiliation, for the soldiers would probably pick the longest route to get from wherever they are to wherever they're going to crucify the criminals, so that many people could witness it. Because remember, crucifixion in the Roman time was not just a punishment for crimes, it was also a deterrent for crimes. The Romans believed that if you saw people parading through the streets bloodied and beaten, carrying this crossbar up to their own crucifixion, and you were able to see them be crucified, you were able to watch them die, then you would think twice about doing something wrong, breaking the law yourself. And so they were using it not just as a punishment, but also as a form of deterrent. And so it was important for them to be able to parade the criminals through the town so people could see them. And they would be carrying their own crossbar. Well, Jesus was beaten so badly, he was almost at the point of death already. He couldn't carry his crossbar. Kind of imagine a railroad tie, and he had to carry that. He couldn't. He just didn't have the strength. So what they did is they grabbed this innocent passerby, this person that just happened to be walking into Jerusalem. Remember, this is Friday. This is the day of the Passover. And so he's here to celebrate the Passover meal. And it says, a certain man from Cyrene, that is modern day Libya, so it's from northern Africa. So he's traveled a good distance to come here. His name is Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Do you have those names in your translations? The father of Alexander and Rufus? It's important for us to recognize that these names are shared, because we've had other stories in the gospel where people have been a part of the story and we haven't had a name given. We've just had the term a man from so-and-so or a certain person. We haven't been given a name, haven't been given a description. Here we not only get the man's name, a certain man from Cyrene, Simon, but then we also get his children's names. We get his sons, Alexander and Rufus. And he was passing by on his way in from the country. And so we have to understand that these names must be important to Mark's audience. For us, why would you share it? If Mark's audience didn't know who these people were, it would be stupid to share their names. It would be a waste of time. But obviously, Mark's audience must have had some kind of connection with Simon, with Alexander, and with Rufus, for Mark takes the time to share their names. And so that's important for us to remember. We believe that Mark is writing for a community in Rome, so there's a very good possibility that Alexander and Rufus, and maybe even Simon himself, had something to do with the people in the community in Rome. We're not sure of the connection, but we know there's a connection because he gives their names. Why else would he give their names if they weren't connected in some way? A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country. And they forced him to carry the cross. They forced him. And this is important because in Jesus' day, Roman authorities, Roman soldiers had the ability by law to ask you to carry their stuff for up to 1 mile. So if they were in a town or in a city or in a village and they were tired, they had the right by law, by Roman law, to grab anybody they wanted, give them their pack, give them anything that they wanted, and say, you need to carry this for me for 1 mile. So that gives us an indication of how far Jesus is going to walk to the cross, because they have commanded this man. They forced him to carry Jesus's cross for him. They forced him to carry this crossbar. And so we know for sure that Jesus was going to be crucified roughly less than a mile away from wherever they're starting. And so in Jerusalem, there have been churches that have been built in the location we believe that the crucifixion happened. And so Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They forced him to walk that at least 1 mile, or at the most 1 mile, carrying Jesus' cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Now, some people believe that that means that the place looked like a skull. In fact, there is a cliff outside of Jerusalem that kind of, if you look at it with the light in the right way, it kind of looks like the shape of a skull. Most likely what this means is that it was a place where people died, thus there were skulls that were buried there. There were dead bodies that were there on a regular basis. So it becomes the place of the skull, not necessarily that the geography made it look like a skull. So they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh. Look at your translations. Do you find that there in verse 23? Wine mixed with myrrh. Yeah. Now look, do you have that very important word right after wine mixed with myrrh? But he did not take it. But he did not take it. So let's unpack this for a second. It was the tradition, especially of women in the community, in the Jewish community, to offer some kind of relief, some kind of love and compassion to people who were being crucified. And so what they would do traditionally, these would be people that maybe wouldn't even know the people being crucified. They would just have this as their ministry. This would be their outreach. This would be their way of sharing the love of God to even criminals. And that is that they would make a mixture of wine and myrrh. Now, of course, we all understand the properties of wine and how wine kind of lightens the load a little bit. Well, myrrh was a very primitive form, or a different form of narcotics. And so you would mix wine with myrrh. In our modern day language, we'd say you would mix wine with marijuana. And this was a mixture that was given to people who were being crucified because it would help to ease their pain. It would, in essence, get them drunk and high so that they wouldn't suffer as much. And so it was the tradition of the women. At this point, this is not the Roman authorities offering him a mixture of wine and myrrh. These are the people that this is their ministry. This is their outreach, that they regularly attend crucifixions, and they offer this mixture to the ones being crucified to give them peace. But Jesus does not take it. Now, we can look at this two ways. Number one, Jesus doesn't take it because it's not Jesus's goal here to avoid the pain. It's not Jesus's focus here to say, how can I escape this? It's for Jesus to go through it, for Jesus to experience it in its totality. But also, too, we have to understand that Jesus said something earlier in the story that we've got to take a look at. So let's turn back to Mark chapter 14, and we're going to look at verse 25. Mark chapter 14, verse 25. Mark chapter 14, verse 25. This puts us in the upper room, in the Last Supper, the Passover meal, and Jesus is talking with his disciples. So we look at chapter 14, verse 25, and Jesus has offered them the cup, and he has talked to them about the significance of the cup and how it represents his spilt blood and his sacrifice. And so in verse 25, Jesus says, "Truly I tell you," first and foremost, remember when we hear "truly I tell you" coming out of the mouth of Jesus, this is going to be a prophetic word. In the Old Testament, prophets would say, "Thus says the Lord," or "the word of the Lord is." Jesus didn't need to say that because, of course, Jesus was the Lord. So he didn't need to say the word of the Lord is, because it's him. So he says, "Truly I tell you," this means this is a prophetic word. "Truly I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." So basically what he's saying is he's presenting the cup in the Last Supper, as he's presenting the cup in the Passover meal, as he's presenting the cup of communion. He's saying to them, we're going to share this cup now, but this is the last thing, this is the last time I will drink of this cup until I drink it anew with you in the kingdom of heaven. So even if Jesus as a human being in his suffering wanted to drink the wine and myrrh, he had already prophesied that he would not drink wine anymore. He would not drink of the fruit of the vine until he drinks it that day in the kingdom of heaven. And so he's living out that prophecy in chapter 14, verse 25. He knew that he was going to be offered the wine and the myrrh on the cross, and he knew that he was going to turn it down. So this is a prophetic word that he has shared, and now in chapter 15 it's been fulfilled. Then they offered him wine and myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him. So what they did is they would lay the crossbeam on the ground, and they would nail him to that crossbeam, and then they would raise it up and attach it to the tall beam, and then they would nail his feet so that he would be stuck on this cross with his arms out and his feet hanging down. Now, in this process of crucifixion, the death would most likely come from asphyxiation, for the body would get so weak that he could no longer hold his chest up, so that his rib cage would push in on his lungs, and because of the beatings, because of the stress, because of all the things that he had experienced up to this point, there's fluids that are building up in his body, which build up in your lungs. And so with the pressure of the ribs and the fluid building up in the lungs, pretty soon you're not going to be able to breathe. And so most people die of crucifixion by asphyxiation. They basically they can't breathe anymore because they can't lift their ribs up off their ribs off of their lungs, and their lungs fill up with fluids. So they crucified him, and it says in verse 24, dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. Now these are the Roman soldiers that are dividing up his clothes and casting lots. So we want to understand why this happened. So let's turn back to Psalm. Keep your hand there in Mark chapter 15. And you're going to go to Psalm 22. Psalm 22, and we're going to look at verses 16 through 18. Psalm 22, 16 through 18. So Psalm 22, verses 16 and 18. Psalm 22 is a psalm of David. So this is a psalm that is written by King David. Again, the psalms were songs, they were prayers, they were liturgies of worship from the time of King David. Most of the psalms were written by King David for specific purposes, and they were written by King David to be used in worship. And so the psalms give us a little bit of an insight into the worship life of Old Testament Israel under the rule of King David. So we're going to look at Psalm 22, and we're going to look at verses 16 through 18. Do you have it? Let's listen. Dogs surround me. A pack of villains encircle me. They pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. And so these are the words of King David, written hundreds of years before Jesus was ever born. And King David was writing those words as poetry. He was writing those words to express his suffering and his struggles. But also, too, God was placing those words in King David so that it could also be a prophecy that will be fulfilled later in the story of Jesus, who, by the way, Jesus is a descendant of David. For both Mary and Joseph came from the house of David. They were in the line of David. That's why they had to go to Bethlehem to report for the census the day that Jesus was born, because that's the city of David. So here we have the lineage of David being connected through the story of Jesus. As David wrote about his hands and his feet being pierced, as about them casting lots for his garment, we have Jesus being crucified, as it says here in verse 24, and they crucified him, dividing up his clothes, and they cast lots to see what each would get. So they pierced his hands and his feet, and then they casted lots to see what clothes that the Roman soldiers would get. This was a traditional thing that the Roman soldiers did. This was kind of a fringe benefit, I guess, of being a Roman soldier who looked after crucifixions, is that you walked away with extra clothes that you either could keep or sell. Now, the thing that's interesting here is that anytime that we see a crucifixion, a crucifix where Jesus is hanging on the cross, we have this nice little white garment, kind of looks like an old-time diaper around Jesus's private parts. Well, that's just done because of the fact that we don't want to be obscene. Jesus was crucified buck naked. Criminals did not have clothes on, so Jesus was naked on the cross. And so they had all of his garments, and they were going through this process of casting lots to see who was going to get the garments to take with them. Again, a fringe benefit, I guess, of being a Roman soldier in charge of crucifixion. But also, too, it's a fulfillment of what has always been. It's a fulfillment of what was always in the works, was always in the plan. And that was a fulfillment of Psalm 22, verses 16 through 18. So we continue on in verse 25. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." Again, it was tradition that when someone was hanging on a cross, above them there was enough wood that was sticking up where they could nail a placard to it, which would give a written description of what they are guilty of. And this is important because remember, crucifixion was a public deterrent to crime. It was a public deterrent to rebellion. So what they would do is they would put the crime, that what they are convicted of, above their head. So when people walk by, they would look and say, oh, that's what that person did. And the hope is that they would say, I'll never do that because I don't want to end up like that. And so they have the placard that's above the head of those being crucified. For Jesus, kind of mockingly, Pilate put down the charge, the King of the Jews. Now remember, this was the charge that the Jewish authorities brought to Pilate for Jesus. Now, it wasn't what they found him guilty of in their trial, because they didn't find him guilty of being the King of the Jews. They found him guilty because he claimed to be the Messiah. He claimed to be the chosen one. And that's what they found offensive. That's what they found heretical, and then they wanted him to die. Well, when they took him to Pilate to convict him of death, to get him the sentence of death, they knew that they couldn't go to Pilate and say, hey, this guy says he's our Messiah, kill him. Because Pilate would say, who cares? They couldn't go to Pilate and say, hey, this guy has blasphemed our faith. Pilate would have said, who cares? I'm not going to do anything about that. So they had to go to Pilate with an accusation that would warrant crucifixion. So they thought up King of the Jews, because what they're saying then is that Jesus is saying that he is over and above Caesar. He is over and above the emperor. And so that is treasonous, and that is punishable by crucifixion, by death. So Pilate didn't believe the accusation. Pilate knew what was going on, but Pilate was trying to avoid an insurrection. He was trying to keep the peace. So he said, well, I'll go ahead and crucify him, but I'm going to mock you because I'm going to put that title above him, and that's what he's going to be being killed for. So every person that walked by Jesus as he was hanging on the cross looked up and saw that he was being crucified because he was the King of the Jews. And the thing that's interesting is that he is the King of the Jews, and he's the King of Kings. And so it wasn't an untruth. It was just a mocking accusation that Pilate used against the religious leaders of that day, because Pilate did not believe that Jesus deserved crucifixion. So in verse 27, they crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Now this is important because if you remember back in chapter 10 of the Gospel of Mark, James and John came to Jesus and they asked Jesus for a favor. Do you remember what the favor was? Yeah, when Jesus came into his kingdom, they said, well, could one of us be on your right and one of us be on your left? And Jesus kind of like side-handedly kind of looked at them and smiled and said, can you truly drink from the cup that I'm going to drink from? And they're like, oh yeah, I can do that. Little did they know he was talking about crucifixion. And so James and John are not on the right and the left of Jesus. It's 2 criminals now that are on the right and left of Jesus. Now look at your translations. Do you have a verse 28? Yeah, I'm reading from the New International Version, and there is no verse 28. It goes from verse 27 to verse 29. 28 has a little footnote. My footnote says, some manuscripts include here words similar to Luke 22:37. Basically, if you're reading from a King James translation, there's a very good possibility that you have a verse 28, because the King James Version, before all the different versions came about, included a verse 28, and the verse 28 basically is a prophetic word that ties together the fact that what is happening to Jesus is needing to happen because it's what the prophets predicted. It doesn't add anything to the story. It doesn't take anything away from the story. If your translation has verse 28 in it, it doesn't mean that the Bible is flawed or anything like that. Even if your translation doesn't have 28 in it, doesn't mean that they're leaving something out, trying to hide something. It's just typically that older manuscripts have been found not to have verse 28 in it. Newer manuscripts have been found to have verse 28 in it. So whether it's in there or not, it's not going to change the outcome of the story. It's not changing the trajectory of the understanding of God's nature. It's not changing anything. It's just an addition, kind of like another stamp of approval to say this is all happening because of the prophetic word that has been shared with us. So looking at verse 29, those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself." And here's a perfect example. Again, we roughly think this is about 33. We're in the year 2020 now. So it was the year 33. And fake news is prevalent. And the spreading of fake news happens very quickly, even without the internet, even without social media. It's always been with us, and I'm sorry to say it will always be with us. It requires the consumer, it requires the watcher, it requires the reader to engage their brain and to think about it. Don't just take everything at face value. It's always been that way and always will be this way, because here we have people walking by, hurling insults at Jesus, using the fake news, because remember, one of the things that was brought up against him in the trial with the Sanhedrin, the trial with the Jewish authorities, was that he said he was going to destroy the temple and build it again in 3 days, which is not quite true. Jesus did stand outside the temple, and when one of his disciples said, "Wow, look at these magnificent buildings, isn't this great?" Jesus looked at him and he said, "Not even a stone will remain unturned." Basically, he said, all of this that you see, all this grandeur, all this pomp and circumstance, all of this wealth is going to be destroyed because it's all fake. It's all impure. And he didn't say what they accused him of saying. So much so that in the trial with the Sanhedrin, before he was even brought to Pilate, they couldn't get witnesses to confirm it because nobody could come together and corroborate what they were saying. They couldn't agree in their testimony. So it never became an official accusation against him. It was just an accusation that was never substantiated. But yet it's gone out. It's spread like wildfire. It's fake news and it's out there. And so they hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, in verse 31, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocking him among themselves. Do you have that in your translations? Among themselves. This is important because the people who passed Jesus in public, they hurled insults. They mocked him. They hurled insults at him. As it says here, they hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying. So they were doing it publicly, sharing the fake news. Well, the chief priests and the scribes, the leaders of the Jerusalem church, the leaders of the Jewish religion at that time, knew that what they were doing was politically motivated. They knew in their heart of hearts that what they were doing was not right. It had nothing to do with him claiming to be the Messiah. It had everything to do with him usurping their power. It had everything to do with Jesus kind of messing up the apple cart, kind of taking everything and throwing it to the side and making what was a thing of the past. And they didn't want to be a thing of the past. They wanted to maintain their power. They wanted to maintain their authority. They wanted to maintain their position. And so they knew in their heart of hearts that what they were doing was untrue. What they were doing was wrong. They were just getting rid of a thorn in their side. So they didn't hurl insults at him publicly. Listen to what they did. In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. Mocked him among themselves. So they stayed in their little group of all the people that thought just like them and acted just like them and had the same perspective of them, and they mocked. It's so easy to mock someone with like-minded people. It's so easy to mock someone in your own little close-knit group. It's much different to do it in public. It's much different to let it shine before the light of the day. And so here we have the leaders who are kind of doing this in private. For they know that even though this is happening, and even though they've done a pretty good public relations job at trying to build a case against Jesus, there's still a lot of people that probably are upset by this. There's still a lot of people that are watching this or experiencing this, and they're questioning why it's happening, or they're stating to themselves that it's wrong, that it shouldn't be happening. And they know that there still could be the chance that there would be a revolt. There still could be a chance that there could be an uprising, and they don't want that. So they're kind of keeping it to themselves. So they mocked him among themselves, and he saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. Verse 32, let this Messiah, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe. Let that Messiah come down off the cross and save himself so that we may see and believe. Let me ask you a question. In your opinion, do you believe that if Jesus would have been able to come down off that cross, if he would have removed himself, he removed his hands from the nails, removed his feet from the nails, and he would come down off that cross with blaze of glory and light shining down out of heaven, and the trumpets of the heavenly angels playing, and the heavenly choir singing, and all the pomp and circumstance, do you think they truly would have believed? It's a very interesting question, isn't it? Yeah, my gut tells me, they wouldn't have bought it, because in 3 days, he is going to come back to life. In 3 days, the tomb is going to be empty. He's going to spend the next 40 days walking around, eating and drinking and talking and sharing with other people, and they're still not going to believe. They're still not going to believe. So even though they say it, it's still mocking, because they're not going to buy it. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe. They wouldn't have seen it, and they wouldn't have believed it. They would have explained it in some way. They would have rationalized it away in some way. The leaders of the Jerusalem church, the leaders of the Jewish faith, have already proven to us through their actions that they aren't buying this Jesus, regardless of what he does. Because look at what has happened over the last 3 years. Look at the miracles he's performed. Look at who Jesus has been, and they still don't believe. Nothing is going to change their minds. And we end with those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. So the criminals that were crucified on his right and his left also were heaping insults on them. They were being crucified because they were criminals. They were in the exact same boat that he was, but yet they, in their time of death, still turned and heaped insults upon him. This is a very low point in Jesus' life. Now, recall this or understand this. We have just read this whole passage from verse 21 all the way up to verse 32, and Jesus has not spoken. Jesus hasn't said a word. He's just suffering. He's going through this. Now, he's taken action. Remember, he refused the wine and the myrrh. But we don't have him saying, hey, no, I'm not going to drink that because a chapter ago when I was in the upper room last night, I told him I wasn't going to drink. It doesn't say that. We have Jesus here just having all these things happen to him. Insults being heaped upon him. Pain being inflicted upon him. Him being led. This is like the sheep to the slaughter. All of this is happening to Jesus. Jesus is participating in it because he's not stopping it, but yet he's just kind of observing it. It's kind of happening to him. And we get to experience that in our lives. Because how many things do we have in our lives that we experience, that we're led into? Things that are happening to us that maybe we didn't necessarily cause, but it's happening to us. Here we have Jesus, again, demonstrating the importance of the humanity that God shows us in Jesus. We do not have the right to look at God and say, you don't know what it's like to, because whatever you fill in that blank with, God knows, because he became Jesus. And one of the things that God definitely knows is he knows what it's like to have things happen to you, things that are unfair, things that should not happen, but they still do. Jesus understands that. So if that's where you find yourself today, know and understand that you have a Savior that knows exactly what you're going through, because he's been there too. Well, that's our study for today. If there's been a blessing in this for you, please share this with other people, because who knows? It might just be the word that they were looking for today. So until we get back together again and pick up with the death of Jesus in verse 32 of chapter 15 of the Gospel of Mark, I pray that you stay safe and that you stay sane.